Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Shao, and I am the president of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our firing line debate on marijuana legalization. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 400 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow at our website, buckleyprogram.com. I'd also like to recognize the American Enterprise Executive Council program for their gracious sponsorship of this event. AEI is a Washington-based nonpartisan research think tank committed to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world through rigorous public policy scholarship. And its executive council here at Yale works to advance campus dialogue about public policy and introduce students and faculty to AEI scholarship. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator and two speakers for today's debate. Dr. Sally Sattel is a lecturer at Yale, a resident scholar at AEI, and the staff psychiatrist at a local methadone clinic in DC. Dr. Sattel was an assistant professor of psychiatry at Yale University from 1988 to 1993 and remains a lecturer here today. Her publications include PCMD, How Political Correctness is Corrupting Medicine, and One Nation Under Therapy with Christina Hoff Summers. We're especially grateful to Dr. Sattel for stepping in to moderate and sponsor today's debate on such short notice, since we found out on Saturday that our last moderator could not make it. Melissa Moore is the Civil Systems Reform Director at the Drug Policy Alliance, where she leads this new initiative to expose the insidious ways the drug war has contaminated systems far beyond the criminal legal system. She received her Bachelor of Arts from the University of California at Berkeley and has worked on social policy for 2 decades, with the last 5 at the Drug Policy Alliance. Ms. Moore will be arguing in the affirmative in today's debate. Howard Husak is the Senior Fellow in Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on municipal government, urban housing policy, and civil society. Before joining AEI, Mr. Husak was Vice President for Research and Publications at the Manhattan Institute. Mr. Husak will be arguing in the negative in today's debate. Regarding the format of today's debate, I'll turn it over to Sally for some brief opening remarks, and then each of our guests will begin with 5-minute opening statements, after which they will both have 2 minutes each to respond. I'll turn it over to Sally to moderate, and then she will ask some of her own questions and take some from the audience. If you're interested in asking a question, please raise your hand and we'll get this mic over to you. And lastly, we'll conclude with 2-minute closing remarks from each speaker and wrap it up by 5:30 p.m. So with that, please join me in welcoming Sally Sattel, Melissa Moore, and Howard Husak to Yale and to the Buckley program.
Here, there, okay. Hey, thanks everyone for coming. So this topic, you probably know, or drugs in general, was very dear to William F. Buckley's heart. In fact, in 1996, I wish I had a slide of it, the cover of the National Review said, the drug war is lost. 1996, that was a while ago. So if you could see today, and remember 1996 was still the tail end. I mean, the crack epidemic had crested, but it was a time of real punitive response. And so I think that was still reverberating when he said the drug war is lost. But if he could see today, I think he'd be much more heartened by many developments and new ideas and practices that are at least trying to balance, public health, personal autonomy, and public order. And it's not easy. But I guess you could say we've come the farthest in that with respect to marijuana policy. So of course that brings us to the debate today, which I'm going to pose in the form of a question, I suppose, which is, should we or should we not legalize marijuana at the federal level, because as you know, it's not at the federal level legal. At the state, 18 states have legalized it, however. And was it a good idea? I guess I'll ask several questions because I know they'll be addressed in the course of things. Was it a good idea that it was legalized in 18 states? And should we push ahead and go for the other 32? So going to start now with, gee, I could just pick who I want to start with, or Melissa. Forgive me, Melissa. Hi, nice to meet you. I'll start with Melissa with her 5-minute opening statement, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and appreciate very much being invited to participate in today's event and the inclusion of me remotely. I know it added to some of the tech rigmarole, so definitely appreciate the accommodation there. You know, I think there's a lot that we'll get into today in great detail, but I think the top lines for marijuana legalization, you know, are quite clear at this point. We know that comprehensive regulation allows us to better ensure community well-being, public health guidelines, and equity. It also gives us more tools to be able to protect young people and provide more comprehensive education around the risk factors that people should bear in mind. And we can also create a tightly regulated legal market that focuses on small businesses, on family farmers, on community participation, not on large corporations necessarily. And we can use tax revenue for community reinvestment and for social good, instead of funding discriminatory prohibition enforcement that tears apart communities and further compounds the barriers that people are facing. And overall, within a regulated market, we're able to protect consumers and provide information for better decision-making by people as well. From my perspective and from Drug Policy Alliance's perspective, as the nation's leading organization working to end the war on drugs and the harms that it causes to individuals and communities, we're very clear that it's time to stop the ineffective and unjust enforcement of cannabis prohibition across this country and begin comprehensively and responsibly regulating marijuana to better serve all of these interests. We know that polling consistently shows that the majority of Americans support legalization, and this is actually one of the few bipartisan issues at this point, and that's including in suburban and rural communities as well. And we know that the stakes are incredibly high. You know, continuing the status quo does a tremendous amount of damage to individuals and communities every year. We know that personal possession of marijuana is the most arrested drug offense in the United States, despite all of the states that have legalized for personal use. In 2020, nearly a third of drug-related arrests in the country were for marijuana possession. And we also know that there are extreme racial disparities within this enforcement, despite the fact that people use cannabis at pretty similar rates across racial and ethnic groups and across income strata as well. But because so many people have been arrested and people are disproportionately low income and people of color, the collateral consequences of arrests as well are disproportionately experienced by this population. And these are all things that end up compounding many of the barriers that people are already facing within their lives. So just to wrap up this opener before we pass the mic on, we know that regulation is a huge opportunity to actually build up and invest in communities that have been the most harmed by the war on drugs. And we know that instead we can direct our resources toward funding job training, economic empowerment, youth development programming, reentry services, and so much more, as opposed to wasting further resources on this ill-gotten marijuana arrest crusade. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Howard Husak.
First, I want to thank Sally Santel for the kind introduction, to the Buckley Society for the invitation, and to show my respects for your important mission here at Yale. And thanks to Melissa for joining the debate. The question of whether marijuana should be legalized has, to a large extent, been settled. Two of the largest states in the nation, California and New York, have followed the examples of Colorado, Oregon, New Jersey, and 13 others in adopting legalization. Voters in 4 states, Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota, approved statewide ballot measures in 2020 to legalize marijuana for personal use. So the federal government, as Dr. Satel pointed out, has been slow to permit financial transactions related to cannabis, but that seems inevitable at a time when a Marist college survey found that there may be 35 million regular users of marijuana. An estimated 145 million Americans live in the states that have legalized it already or a short drive away. And simply put, laws cannot be practically enforced when a large portion of the population refuses to follow them. That's the lesson of the 18th Amendment and its subsequent repeal. There'll be a test later on what the 18th Amendment was. At the same time, we'd be blind or foolish not to acknowledge that marijuana use poses significant dangers. Although medical marijuana dispensaries have become widespread, even in states which have not legalized recreational use of cannabis, the Food and Drug Administration has never approved an application for cannabis for the treatment of any disease or condition. This at a time when our standards for the effectiveness of prescription drugs are the highest in the world, and we insist that they should be. The effects on brain development of pot use have been revealed as worrisome. Study in the Journal of Child Psychology has showed a substantial increase in psychotic-like disorders in adolescents. The Mayo Clinic has found that chronic use may interfere with normal brain development. I understand that nobody is arguing for legalization of marijuana for those under 21, but this is at a time when 80% of high school seniors say they find marijuana easy to obtain. The idea, once seemingly exaggerated, definitely exaggerated, of marijuana as a gateway drug to harder drug use, I saw all the scare films when I was in high school, it was a long time ago, has, however, been shown to have salience. The Center for Disease Control reports that although the evidence that marijuana use leads to harder drugs is limited, it also shows that of those who do use it are more likely to become addicted to other drugs, including tobacco and alcohol. At a time when the U.S. has seen an epidemic of drug overdoses, 100,000 deaths in the past year, the most recorded ever in 1 year, one must not be indifferent to the possibility of knock-on deleterious effects of marijuana use. The literature about marijuana's health effects is voluminous. It includes the increased potency of current cannabis, the risks of traffic death, and emotional effects such as depression and the lack of life satisfaction. So it is that we have a very difficult circle to square, and in that I'm not really disagreeing with Melissa. The understanding that continuing to criminalize marijuana use is no longer practical, with the acknowledgement that its use can be harmful. Thus, our challenge today is that of combining legalization with harm reduction as we craft a regulatory regime conscious of public health. State and local governments are on the front lines of having to reflect on the right course of action. Too often, at present, they're cheerleading marijuana as an engine of economic development and a source of tax revenues. Relying on pot sales to balance budgets overlooks the harm that it can do to citizens, including that of sapping their interest in productive work. The state should no more be encouraging marijuana use than it should be encouraging sports gambling, another horse that has left the barn, also seen as a source of tax revenue. Both activities should fall in the same category in which Bill Clinton once classed abortion, safe, legal, and rare. State cannabis control boards should see their role as that of discouraging, not encouraging use. As we do with tobacco, public health infomercials should emphasize the harm, not the transitory pleasure of marijuana. It's simply not the state's role to encourage hedonism over the sense of life satisfaction that arises from true personal achievement. Nor should we coerce disadvantaged, including minority communities, to be the portals of marijuana revenue. It's notable that in New York and New Jersey, local communities have the right to opt out of cannabis sales and use sites, and hundreds, including affluent suburbs, have done just that. In New York, 884 communities have declined to permit a cannabis use site. That's 58% of all municipalities in the state. In contrast, communities of color, disproportionately located in big cities, including New York City, are hostage to the decisions of city governments to opt in a search for revenue. Residents of these communities deserve to be enfranchised to vote by neighborhood as to whether they want to welcome marijuana dispensaries or, when it comes to hard drugs, so-called safe injection sites. Drug use has been a scourge they have had to deal with for far too long. They should not be asked to bear a disproportionate burden of hosting sales and use sites. It's misguided to adopt the view that because members of such communities were disproportionately swept up in the marijuana law enforcement dragnet, as they were, that their experience should lead to their being drawn into the legal marijuana trade. Far better to rid our disadvantaged communities of the scourge of drug use and encourage young people to learn the skills for socially positive occupations. Let's think of cannabis as some cross between alcohol and tobacco, a drug we regulate and tolerate, but whose use we should not encourage. Let's hope we do not permit some version of big pot, which I dare say is likely to emerge, to advertise. We do not permit tobacco advertising, after all. We should consider deploying a limited number of state-authorized, privately owned cannabis dispensaries, just as many states have facilities such as those for hard liquor. And we must take care in our zeal to realize cannabis tax revenues not to price the legal drug at a level so high that the black market continues to thrive. This is a clear and present danger. It's already taking place in California. The Los Angeles Times, which supported legalization in California 6 years ago, now calls the marketplace there, quote, a mess, and notes that, quote, the black market is as big as ever, with roughly 75% of sales coming from unlicensed sellers. The dangers include adulterated products, as we saw right here in Connecticut, when tragically a 16-year-old high school student recently was hospitalized after inhaling marijuana laced with fentanyl. It occurs to me that university students should advocate against cannabis use because the pro states so often support illegal cartels which undermine the legitimate governments of other nations, notably Mexico. In conclusion, the combination of a black market and a public health emergency are problems we must strive to avoid. Legalization is with us. A wise regulatory regime has yet to be crafted. Thank you very much.
Hey, Melissa, 2 minutes to respond. Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
Oh, okay, yes, thank you.
So there's a lot to unpack there, as I know we will throughout the rest of this event. It's interesting in terms of the revenue and the cartel point that was just made. What we've seen in states with legal access is actually far less cartel activity related to marijuana. And so if that is indeed a concern, legalization is actually one avenue to be able to achieve that goal quite successfully compared to the data that we've seen. And in terms of the access points and what we're talking about when it regards the ongoing legacy market or illicit market, part of the issue in California in particular is the fact that a lot of counties, despite the fact that the ballot measure, Prop 64, to legalize cannabis in California was approved by voters all across the state by an overwhelming majority, what we had in California was a situation in which county executives and others were able to unilaterally opt out of retail sales of cannabis. And so that means that people within those jurisdictions who wanted to be able to participate and who voted in the affirmative for a legal regulated market are in effect banned from being able to participate in it in their county of residence. And so you still have an ongoing illicit market that results from people wanting to be able to access a product, it being available to them, and their legal channels of being able to access it being blocked off from them. In response to that, what you see in the rubric for legalization in New York, for example, which I worked on that bill quite closely, full disclosure, is a separate process that is actually driven by the will of the residents within jurisdictions. And so there can be a process to opt out. The deadline for doing so in New York was at the end of this past year. And from there, if a municipality has opted out by a vote of the governing body of that jurisdiction, and people in that area want to opt back in, there's actually a democratic process for them to be able to do so via a referendum, a public referendum. And I would encourage, my co-speaker here today to actually spend some time in the neighborhoods that he's discussing. We know that the impact of marijuana prohibition and the marijuana arrest crusade in New York was vastly disproportionate. Depending on what part of the city you were in and what your skin color was and your age, your experience was absolutely almost the exact inverse of somebody in different parts of the city over the course of the marijuana arrest crusade. And when we're talking about moving forward, it's not just with regard to access to cannabis for people who want to be able to consume themselves. It's actually an opportunity to be able to right some of the economic toll that the marijuana arrest crusade took. There was an analysis done a couple of years ago by the New York City Comptroller that showed that 7 out of the 10 neighborhoods in New York City with the highest marijuana arrest rates also had the lowest economic indicators. And so as we're moving forward, that study and the methodology doesn't indicate causality, but it certainly shows a compounding factor that criminalization held in people's lives. And the fact that people were blocked from being able to access federal loans for higher education, from being able to access stable housing in many instances, or having job opportunities that they would have otherwise had without that arrest record hanging over their head, right now is returning the page and saying that we are going to legalize cannabis and have legalized cannabis in New York. It's a really important moment to be able to provide opportunities for people who want to be part of the industry. Nobody's forcing anybody to take out an application for a license or to move forward in this space. But for those who do want to take part, and especially for those who have felt the direct impacts in their own lives and in their communities, there's absolutely an economic driver behind that. And as we've seen across the whole state, this is an opportunity as well for people in more rural areas upstate, in farming communities that have taken a really big hit with the drop in agricultural prices over the last 5 to 10 years, to be able to cultivate a plant in conjunction with their other crops that'll help provide them some economic stability as well. So again, a lot to unpack. I don't want to go over my allotted time here, so I will pass it back to you.
Great. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes. You got an extra 2 minutes. You used an extra 2 minutes. Now you stick to your 2 minutes.
Okay,
Thank
stick
you,
it. I agree with Melissa about not punishing those who were arrested for marijuana. It certainly was disproportionate. I'm not sure why you think I've never spent time in poor neighborhoods, but I have. I have grandchildren who live in Brooklyn. They go to public school. I walk all around Brooklyn all the time. I don't know if you do, but you seem to accuse me of not doing that, but okay. But I'll say this, we should certainly not bar ex-offenders from federal student loans. Should their records be held against them in getting jobs? No, I think successful prison reentry is one of the great challenges we have when we have 8 million people in prison, in federal prisons. It's a big problem. So we agree about that. As for agriculture being an engine of economic growth, I have a piece in the City Journal today noting that upstate New York has banned fracking, which would be a dynamic way to jumpstart the economy there, as it has in nearby Pennsylvania. Jobs pay as much as $127,000 a year, a lot more than for that marijuana sales are likely to. So, can it be a small part of an area's revitalization? Yes, but we shouldn't pin our hopes on marijuana cultivation. Also note that California and Oregon have been characterized by large illegal black market plantations. They're ones that are feeding this black market. So that's difficult to enforce. So we encourage rural cultivation at some risk, and it can't be done without serious enforcement. I'm also somewhat torn, but somewhat concerned about giving priority to those who had arrest records to get to the head of the line for getting legal marijuana license. Governor Hochul of New York has just proposed that last week. Most young people, most adults in disadvantaged neighborhoods work hard and play by the rules. Should we reward by letting them go to the head of the line and those who broke the rules? I understand we may have a problem with those rules. I have a problem with those rules, but nonetheless, they made a choice to break the rules. Should we give them the chance to go to the head of the line? Is it good for those poor neighborhoods to have a concentration? There's a whole literature on the concentration of illegal or legal liquor sales in poor neighborhoods and how deleterious they are to the public health of those neighborhoods. Do we want the same thing to happen because of a profusion of marijuana licenses based on a past inequity? I don't think so.
Well, I'm going to ask some questions, and then I don't want to take up all the time at all. I want you guys to ask a lot as well. Clearly, this is an exercise in balancing trade-offs. The arguments can be compelling on both sides. But Melissa, so I'll ask the first question of you. Why isn't it, I mean, obviously you're a proponent of legalization, but why isn't it enough to just decriminalize and maybe have homegrown marijuana and sharing through cooperatives, this kind of a thing? What would you settle for that?
Unfortunately, the experience that we had in New York is a case study of why decriminalization is not enough. The legislature in New York was actually one of the earliest to decriminalize cannabis. It did so in 1977 in response to the Rockefeller drug laws, coming at especially students at a crucial point in their lives and imposing harsh sentences. So it was actually parents and people from the suburbs in New York that worked with the legislature to establish decriminalization in 1977. And for a while, it more or less worked until the rise of stop and frisk and broken windows policing and real targeting of communities of color in a different way. And that's when we saw the marijuana arrest crusade in New York really ramp up to extreme levels, to the point that more than 50,000 people a year, the vast majority of them Black and Latinx New Yorkers, despite the fact that people use at similar rates, were being arrested every single year, despite the fact that New York State had decriminalized cannabis. That's more people than fit in Yankee Stadium every single year, year after year after year, to the point that we reached more than 800,000 low-level cannabis arrests just in the last 25 years alone in New York. So I would say that, the preponderance of enforcement and harm in that instance, and we know that it's the same to a not quite as extreme scale, but the same goes in other places as well. We know that decriminalization is not enough to solve for the consumer protections that we need and the adequate testing of product and making sure that people are able to access cannabis that's safe for them, is not contaminated, and so that they actually know the potency that they're potentially going to consume. A lot has been discussed around the increased potency in cannabis that's available today, and for people to be able to make wise decisions around that, the same way that consumers of alcohol do in terms of being able to decide if they want to drink a glass of wine or have a beer or drink hard liquor, which they know to be more potent and maybe will have less of a dose in that case. To be able to balance that potency and dosing, decriminalization doesn't get at that at all. And that's one of the really big, the big drivers. Even though we've seen, arrests to a degree come down, it's still the most commonly arrested offense, drug-related offense in the country. So we know decrim is just not enough to satisfy both the justice aims of the conversation, nor is it enough to satisfy the consumer protection and protection for young people as well, that having an actual legalized and regulated marketplace would allow. But I would say that, just as a final point here, regulation doesn't necessarily preclude co-ops and home grow and things of that nature. In fact, in the law that we passed in New York, both of those are really crucial components that we strongly support and I think are really important. I think, there have been discussions in the past about state cannabis shops. In fact, that was on the table in New Mexico for quite a while. I think all of these things are really important models that should be further explored, but federal prohibition really stands in the way of a lot of that.
Thank you. Howard, you could come on up.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not
Can I
going to
just stay here?
Yes, you should stay.
Okay,
here.
I'll stay here.
I'm not going to do two follow-ups. That's your guys' job. So Howard, would you see a kind of regime, as you noted more reluctantly? In fact, you you kind of challenged Mark Kleiman, the late Mark Kleiman, sadly, a brilliant policy analyst,
Yes, I knew him.
drug expert. In his general philosophy was what he called grudging toleration.
Right.
And so in that spirit, excuse the pun now, would you kind of envision the sort of regime we have for alcohol?
Oh, definitely. I think that's right, except there's so much attractive advertising to encourage alcohol use. That worries me, especially because we prohibit tobacco advertising. So this is a spectrum. Somehow we consider tobacco advertising, it's a safe stimulant, not safe, it's a legal stimulant, but we prohibit advertising. I think we do not want to encourage grudging toleration. We don't want to encourage drug use. Drug use is not a good thing. It's something we should tolerate, but we don't want advertising. I fear that Melissa is envisioning a bit of an idle fantasy, which I don't think is going to happen, which is family farms, small businesses, cooperatives. I think we're going to see the emergence of big cannabis, and it's going to try to promote as much use of cannabis as it can in league with state governments who are hungry for revenue. And that is a very worrisome prospect.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I call that big bud.
Big what?
Big bud.
Big bud, yes.
So, Melissa, one of my areas of interest is vaping, and we won't go. Maybe another time we'll go into that. But I'll just give you the shorthand. If you're a smoker, you should vape. I mean, the data are clear. I can provide them. But the only reason I bring it up is not to put in a plug for vaping, which should be advertised for adults, but that there is utter hysteria about teen vaping. I can just, how do you envision that exploding on the scene once, I realize, you know, marijuana is much more liberalized than it was a while ago, but if it were to really become much more widespread?
Yeah, I appreciate the question and your perspective as well, given your research. You know, what's interesting is that marijuana use, despite more and more states legalizing, what we've seen is that marijuana use among youth has actually decreased in recent generations compared to the historically high rates in the 1970s. And that's according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which showed that use has remained pretty much stable since 2005 among young people 12 to 17 years old. The Monitoring the Future study, which surveys 8th and 10th and 12th graders across the country, has shown pretty similar results. And so I think, you know, the conversation hopefully will be able to shift more to how to assess the potential risks of cannabis, especially for young people, but also how to bring it out of the shadows if somebody is having a hard time. Drug Policy Alliance doesn't only work on cannabis. You know, we work on the harms of drug use and the drug war writ large. And, you know, what we see over and over again is opportunities to be able to reach folks when they're in a situation when there is problematic use, you know, whether that's of cannabis in a young person, whether that's of a different substance in an older person, but often there's something driving that. And with young people, it's been the case for far too long that because that use, you know, just for anybody within their state or within the society was criminalized, that pushed folks to the shadows, and especially young people at really crucial points for them to be able to get better information and for them to talk to a trusted adult if they were experiencing an issue. We know that quite a few young people self-medicate using cannabis if they have an anxiety disorder or if there's something else going on in their lives that can be really troubling to them. And then being able to speak to an adult and seek care and seek potential counseling for whatever the actual underlying issue is a far better scenario than that person being thrown up against a wall and frisked and then arrested and having the rest of the course of their lives, you know, potentially derailed or at least severely compromised because of cannabis criminalization. So, you know, it's a both and, I would say, of, you know, of course, removing the criminal penalty side, which don't serve anybody, and it sounds like we agree on pretty substantially. But on the other side of that, it's a lot more education. It's a lot going beyond the stigma and a lot of just kind of like the scare tactics that have been used for so long, because kids see through that and they know that cannabis is a widely used substance, but being able to actually, drill down and have a real conversation about the risk factors, about the considerations, is much more feasible and much more plausible within a regulated market. And then you also have protections on who can even purchase cannabis that are far more robust in a regulated market than they are just if within the illicit space. Nobody's asking for an ID on the corner, but folks are asking for an ID at a dispensary.
Did you want to respond to? You can respond. I mean, you can pick up on.
I'd rather get the students in.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to ask then. Then let me ask. I'm compelled to ask Melissa one more question because actually Howard sort of leaned over to me when you were talking about the data and said, "Is that true?" And I have to admit, national data will sometimes conceal more localized trends. So I guess, well, I guess we shouldn't get into the weeds on whose facts are right.
So
And I don't challenge your national facts at all. But I think one reason this issue is hard to debate is because, people can find often their own facts and they're true and they seem to compete. So I guess that was a little editorializing.
We were talking about whether marijuana use is or not. Of course, you can interpret from that. You could take that. You could take the view that the current the criminalization regime discouraged use.
There's a deterrent, yeah.
I mean, they could have had a deterrent effect. Again, I'm not advocating for continued criminalization, but we could take that view.
I mean, we haven't seen criminalization be effective in reducing use of any other substance. So I would posit that that's, probably not the most likely driver of that. But what we, in response to the really good question about local data and, especially in states that have already legalized, what have we seen? What is borne out there compared to the national trends? And in that regard, a study that looked at trends in states with laws for legal adult use between 2008 and 2016 didn't find any increases in marijuana use prevalence or frequency of use post-legalization among that critical high school age demographic. And similarly, a systematic review, a meta-analysis of states with legal medical marijuana laws did not find increased use among youth after those were enacted as well. So what we see is that it takes the cool factor out of it in a lot of cases, and kind of similar to how we've seen young people react to Facebook as more and more adults have gotten on board with it. It's like if your uncle's on Facebook, it's not as cool anymore. And what we've seen in states with legal access is one of the largest demographics that has increased use is people who are older, either senior citizens or other folks who are well on in their years and might be having some chronic pain issues or other issues that they want to deal with and medicate using cannabis, and it's actually been quite helpful to them.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just say I didn't inhale, but as a senior citizen. But I will say that
After your comment, we'll open
I'm
it
just
up.
going to comment
Yeah,
real quickly
that's
on that. On this idea that scare tactics are used, we need better education, remove the stigma. The stigma is not only about, or the negative aspect of marijuana is not only about will you get addicted to harder drugs, will the cannabis be laced with fentanyl, will it create there was a famous J. Edgar Hoover movie about that was the ultimate in scare tactics, but drug use is a false path to satisfaction. We can have education which does not say, oh, come out of the shadows, we understand why you're using drugs. Well, no, actually, we want to counsel you not to use drugs. That's what I'm not hearing from Melissa.
No, I think that's absolutely the case. And Drug Policy Alliance has actually worked on a curriculum that has been, tested rigorously and is being incorporated now into some health curriculums for 10th graders across the country that does really specifically go into the potential risks and harms of multiple substances, and really teaches young people how to use their critical thinking skills to evaluate what the potential dangers could be for themselves, but also what to do if one of their peers is struggling with problematic use, or if they see somebody overdose in a situation, to be able to call 911 and know just how to protect themselves and some of their peers in those situations. So I I agree, you know, a lot more education.
I'm glad to hear that. I'll just say, I listen closely to what you say. You say, in the states of the legals, there hasn't been any increase. That tells me that it could be at a stable but worrisome level.
Okay, guys and gals,
Isn't guys a,
I don't know, I've already probably offended someone, but please, if you have questions, we're ready. They're ready. Yes, Jasper.
tell us who you are, what your major is, what year you're in, something so we
And
can.
how much you smoke. Okay. Don't do that.
I don't, so I'll lead with that. But I'm a senior. My name's Jasper. I study ethics, politics, and economics. I'm wondering how each of you evaluate the lessons of San Francisco in drug policy and thinking about legalization and how to address kind of epidemics of drug addiction. Because I think the city's definitely been kind of a laboratory for political experiments with this kind of thing. And I'm wondering whether each of you kind of assess the lessons differently.
Well, what about San Francisco specifically? I mean, San Francisco has an epidemic of hard drug users, of disturbed individuals living on the streets. What did you have in mind specifically?
Basically, this past year, I think there's been this just widespread tolerance for drug use, drug sales in public, and legal use sites in order to somehow reduce, I think, prison populations,
Right.
just reduce the burden on police officers.
Right. Well, this veers a little into a different sphere, but I don't think legal marijuana use should undermine public order. Public order is essential to the dynamic functioning of any city. And so when we give up on maintaining public order, when we think it's fine to inject hard drugs in public, to live in a tent on the street and do that, social norms should not be trumped by our concerns about criminalization and its deleterious effects. I think San Francisco has gone too far in abandoning public order.
I'll say I think there are a number of causal factors that need to be untangled when we're talking about San Francisco or any large city. And key among them is, despite the fact that there has been a more of a public health approach in the past few years to drug use in San Francisco, kind of writ large, there has not been the resources to actually be able to provide the sorts of supports that'll help people transition out of that use. We know that stable housing and access to housing is a crucial driver that ends up, the denial of housing or somebody just not being able to afford housing is a really significant causal factor in somebody ending up on the street. And drug use at that point is more visible than it would be for somebody who's more resourced using whatever substance they choose to do, which also happens at pretty significantly high rates. It's just behind closed doors. And so I think in part we have an oversaturation in people's view of what's happening because it is on the street, because people don't have anywhere to go. But I think that's a failure of a lot of policies surrounding housing access for people in San Francisco in particular, where we've seen rental rates absolutely skyrocket throughout the course of the tech boom. I'm a native Californian, so I can speak to this with some degree of familiarity. I actually went to school in the Bay Area and I saw a lot of this change happen. It wasn't overnight, but it was very swiftly. And a lot of the sort of anchoring points in people's lives became upended. And so I think there's a tendency to talk about drug use as a causal factor there because it is so visible in some instances. But I think there's so much more behind it. And the solution is going to take actually dealing with those underlying causes as opposed to criminalizing people that are clearly in a situation that nobody is setting out to when they're young, like, oh, let me live in a tent on the street in San Francisco. Like, that's not anybody's aspiration, I don't think. And so it's a matter of things having gone off the rails in that person's life and, in the various systems that should instead be providing support for people being able to move on in their life, and instead being mired in a situation that isn't beneficial to them, and that I don't think anybody wants to see. But it's a matter of coming up with sound policy to address that.
I fear that Melissa is conflating a number of things. A great number of those who are living on the street are suffering from untreated behavioral health issues. We have failed as a society, I agree, to provide the resources, the facilities to allow people to go somewhere off the street. This is not a matter of housing prices. Not everybody can afford to live in San Francisco. That's just how cities work. We do have an obligation to address and provide, it could be shelters, institutional care, supportive housing, but rents are not the problem.
This gentleman up there. Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't see you. This lady and then that gentleman?
I'm gonna keep going, so I'll go around.
Okay, and start walking up when it's about time because you don't have a watch. Please.
Hi, my name is Aaron. I'm a sophomore. I'm majoring in history. One of the things that I've noticed about the rhetoric that follows this drug legalization on all fronts is it's focusing primarily on users of drugs, but I'm also worried about the distributors of drugs. We've seen that, like, I have the numbers here. The black market with marijuana sales has exploded after legalization, even in areas that have legalized it. Colorado has a bigger market than ever before. 80% of California's marijuana sales go through the black market, 70% in Massachusetts. These numbers are scary, and like a lot of people are still getting laced drugs from these black markets. If we're not going to criminalize this, if we're not going to punish people severely for this, how do we propose getting rid of black market dealers, especially when we consider that black market weed, because it doesn't need regulation, is cheaper than legal weed?
Two things. I think pricing is a really big deal. And so if states are so hungry for revenue that they price legal marijuana at a very high price, that will drive people to the black market. There is some deterrent. If they're relatively close, people may be skittish about buying illegally. But I would be interested in what Melissa has to say about whether we should arrest illegal distributors in a legal context.
No, I don't. If we're moving away from criminalization and recognizing that there are really significant issues that it poses in terms of enforcement, I don't think doubling down on criminalization within a legal framework makes much sense at all. But there is an ongoing issue, and I will say, in light of the statistics that you cited of California, 2/3 of California municipalities prohibit marijuana businesses from setting up shop. That flies in the face of what residents want. The vast majority of Californians voted in favor of Prop 64, and then you have a unilateral action from a county executive or other municipal decision maker opting out without any sort of recourse. There was no trajectory within the California legalization framework of Prop 64 in order to allow a public referendum process where it could actually be determined by the will of the voters in that jurisdiction of what they wanted. And I think that's a really significant driver of the illicit market in California. And that's something that hasn't really been reckoned with. If you were to allow people in those 2/3 of the municipalities that have opted out to actually be able to access a cannabis business in their jurisdiction that is regulated according to all of the parameters that we've talked about, I think we would see a real decrease in the illicit market. And another big factor is the double licensing process in California. We've seen this in a number of states. New York was looking at these lessons very clearly, and so the regulation bill that passed last year there was very clear about not repeating some of these mistakes, but making sure that there is one single state entity that can dispense a license is really important. In California, part of the challenge to people being able to be part of the regulated and legal market has been a challenge on the licensing front. We see people not being able to jump through all of the hoops or pay the bribes that are needed in some instances. That came out in Massachusetts, where a former town clerk, I believe it was actually caught asking for bribes to be able to get the local approval that was necessary for people to move forward in the licensing process there. So there's a lot of oversight that's needed, but more than anything, what we've seen under prohibition is that just trying to block people's access doesn't work. And we'd be far better off making sure that people can actually access a safe supply, a tested supply close to them. Because what we know in a place like California that has a really well-established illicit market, if you don't do that, people will continue to access things on the illicit market, which isn't the goal.
I'll just say, there's certainly a logic to that. At the same time, county executives are elected. City councils are elected. There was no referendum in New York State. The legislature passed it. We don't know how it would have fared had there been a referendum. There is accountability. To say that a county executive unilaterally did something by fiat, that county executive, if there's really a concern about not having access, then advocates should organize and unseat that county executive. That's called democracy.
Okay.
Hi.
It's on.
Hi. Thank you both for being with us. We appreciate
Let's
it.
speak
I
up.
can't really hear you.
Oh, thank you both for being with us. We appreciate it a lot. So how do you guys foresee the public health space transforming in order to address the need that there is amongst young people that drives them towards, abusing
I really
drugs?
can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. So how do you foresee the public health space transforming to address the kind of needs that young people need, especially in regards to abusing drugs?
Well, Melissa
Hear
said
that,
that
Melissa?
she's helped. She said, how do we envision the public health space transforming in order to advise young people as they approach the decision whether to use drugs? I'll defer to Melissa to start because she's talked about a curriculum that she developed, so I think she knows more than I do.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big part of the focus for Drug Policy Alliance and for other advocates here. We're not just opening the floodgates willy-nilly. There is actually a lot of thought behind, so what actually comes post-legalization and what does that look like? And I think, in many ways, as we were discussing before, legalization allows for reality-based conversations, especially with young people. It's similar to the way that we've been able to move around comprehensive sex ed and recognizing that abstinence only was not a successful teaching mechanism or policy there. And that's proven way more effective for young people. So states can also use a portion of tax revenue to be able to fund just state education writ large, and also specific programming for young people to be able to build up their understanding, again, of the risk factors. And I think that's a larger public health conversation, right? I mean, we're in a time frame in which we are seeing skyrocketing overdose rates across the country. As was mentioned earlier, and Drug Policy Alliance is one of the leading organizations working to fight against overdose, to save people's lives every day by shifting policy to be more public health centered, to be more person centered, and to recognize that prohibition in and of itself has not been successful here 50 years in on the war on drugs. So how do we have deeper and better and more comprehensive conversations with young people about the various levels that they need to take into account in terms of their own life and also keeping themselves and their peers safe?
Okay, time for,
Yeah,
gotta wrap
it
up.
sounds good.
This is your final statement.
Oh, it's my
Okay.
final statement. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I want to thank again the Buckley Society, all of you who joined us today. Thanking Melissa for willing to put up with my sharp words, sharp elbows, whatever they are. I certainly respect what you're doing and appreciate you joining us today. I'll just say this. I feel that emphasizing the sins of the past has occupied a good deal of my counterparts' discussion today. The disproportionate arrests, the side effects of stop and frisk, the disproportionate concentration in communities of color of these arrests. All of these things are true, but they do not themselves provide guidance for the subtle regulatory regime that we have to craft as we go forward today. And that regime has to somehow balance discouraging the use of drugs, marijuana, we have to acknowledge that by legalizing, we are sending a message, including a message to young people, that this is not a deeply harmful substance, but yet it may be. It may be, if it's not deeply harmful medically, it may be a very poor life choice. We can't shrink because we're so worried about resorting to these discredited scare tactics from saying things that are not positive about drug use. And we have to be, that honesty has to include the idea that satisfaction is not to be garnered through drug use. So I guess I'm a political conservative. I'm also a social conservative, and so I'm kind of a neo-Victorian in that way. I know the Victorians were hypocrites. Sherlock Holmes used opium, but they didn't advertise it. I'm worried it's going to be advertised. It's going to become more widespread, that we're sending a message of acknowledgement that could be subtly become a message of encouragement, and we have to figure out a way not to do that. Think about, do you see these scare advertisements for tobacco use that run on television supported by state health authorities? These are really devastating ads, people dying from lung cancer. Those are scare commercials, but we don't shrink from doing that when it comes from tobacco. Why should we not consider at least giving people pause as they make the choice to use marijuana? Thanks for having me.
Listen, 1 minute if you can.
Sure, I'll keep it tight. I mean, I think there is a shared concern around advertising and around big business coming into this space, and that's certainly something that I spend a lot of my time on, is preventing that, and actually centering smaller businesses. And that is something that is not usually part of the market dynamics in our country, but within legalization, we actually have an opportunity to not just go about business as usual, but to actually set up guardrails and frameworks that are going to support family farmers, for example, and cooperatives and micro businesses. And that's precisely what we've put in place in New York State, where the first provisional licenses to be able to cultivate cannabis ahead of the actual adult use market starting up later this year have gone to small farmers that are the process is open to the farmers that have already been farming hemp in New York State, which is predominantly smaller businesses. I think there is an opportunity to do things differently. I mean, we've also banned advertising for cannabis, with the exact frame of mind. We don't want this especially presented to young people in that light. This is something that there's a lot of focus on. I think regulation often gets conflated with commercialization, but that doesn't have to be the case. And we actually have an opportunity to do things differently, to move our public policy wisely in a way that reflects our values, and also is an opportunity to build up our communities.
Thank you so much. And you really said, I think, the key words of doing something differently. I think most people, maybe not all, but most people want to do something differently. It's really hard. You've got facts on one hand and values on the other, and people weigh values differently. And the facts are tough because, sometimes facts that would appear to bolster one side are chosen, and other times another set are chosen. So you have to adjudicate that really carefully. It's not going to be in this room right now. It's going to be when you leave, and do some serious research if this is an issue that interests you. But the point here today was really to almost expose the anatomy of the kinds of questions you need to consider and the kinds of trade-offs. I'm going to put a plug in. I was not involved in this book. It's wonderful. It's are you familiar with this, Melissa? I don't know if you can see me holding it up. It's called Marijuana Legalization, What Everyone Needs to Know. And Mark Kleiman was one of the authors. It's Oxford University Press. These folks are nonpartisan on this issue at all. And even though it was written, I think, 5 years ago, it's still extremely relevant. And for anyone who wants to pursue it further, this really is very good. It's just every question you could possibly have, and organized brilliantly so you can see the questions. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Howard and Melissa, and all of you for coming, and thank you for inviting me. And I know you want to make a final comment, right, Kevin?
I just want to say thank you, Sally. Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Melissa, for joining us.
Thanks, Melissa.